Hello and welcome to Speaking Spirit, where we talk about all things spiritual. Your host, John Moore, is a shamanic practitioner and spiritual teacher. And now, here's John.
Hello, everybody. As I record this, it is a beautiful morning. It's a Saturday morning. We're in mid-May right now. This is an absolutely beautiful time of year in the part of the world that I am. The trees are budding and blooming, and the flowers are blooming, and the birds are singing, and it's a very lovely day. I want to welcome my listeners wherever you are. I'm excited to see people from all over the world listening to my podcast. I try to make it interesting to as wide an audience as I can, but still talk about things that I know something about. Otherwise, and you'll have to excuse me, I'm having a little, with spring comes allergies. I have a little bit of, if you hear a little bit of congestion or, I have sniffles. I'm not sick. It's just my spring allergies acting up. And my voice, I realize, is a little bit scratchy this morning as well. Same reason. And that's okay. I live with it. It's totally fine. Today, I'm going to talk about kind of a darker topic. And it's a topic that's extremely important to me. And I'm going to share a lot about my personal story with you because it's important to the topic. It's important to understand where I'm coming from and why this is a topic that is important to me. I want to say it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart, but it's not dear, certainly, but it's important. And so today I'm going to talk about trauma and what that is from a spiritual, particularly shamanic perspective. So when a shaman looks at trauma, what's going on? What's happening there? How do shamans in indigenous cultures or shamanic practitioners in practicing core shamanism or I like to modern shamanism is such a weird phrase. It's kind of an oxymoron. But anyway, people who are not connected with an indigenous culture who are practicing shamanism as a healing tool, how do they see and treat trauma and what goes on and why that's important? My personal take is that trauma is an epidemic. It's a pandemic, the way that it's sort of a silent pandemic. It's so common, and people don't see it. People don't see its effect. They don't understand. I'm going to talk a lot about that as well. How it can go invisible for for ages, and a lot of people don't know. Don't understand what's going on with them sometime, and that's part of my own story. So when I talk about trauma, I always, if you've listened to this podcast before, I like to define my terms so that not because my definition of things is correct or better than anybody else's, but so that you understand what I'm talking about when I say the word trauma. So trauma, there's a couple different kinds of trauma, right? There's physical trauma where something severe happens to your body. You get into a car accident or something along those lines. There's damage to the body. That's called trauma, right? It's damage that happens. So, but I'm not talking necessarily about that type of trauma. I'm talking about what some people consider psychological trauma and what shamans consider or, look at as a wound to the soul. I'm going to talk a whole lot about that today. So psychological trauma, what happens, how, what's the process, what's going on there? So trauma is any time there is a shock or extreme fear to the system, right? So this could happen, obviously we think about post-traumatic stress disorder, frequently associated with people in wartime. Lots of shocking, horrible things happen in wartime. And, they used to call it shell shock or combat fatigue or, all of these different terms for it. And, we did a terrible job for so many years, and I'm not sure we're doing much better at bringing people back from wartime situations and helping them through the trauma that they experience. So there's a couple of ways that trauma happen and that are sort of multiply or make things worse, right? So, and, PTSD from war is not the only kind of trauma. Everybody experiences trauma at some point, but, not everybody gets PTSD. There are things that can make that more likely to happen. And then I think it's unfortunate that, there is no separate diagnosis for developmental trauma, which is trauma that happens to children. Because I do think that it presents, from a medical perspective, from the medical model, that it presents its own sets of challenges and needs to be recognized and diagnosed. And a lot of, from reading some of the literature and listening to lectures about it, a lot of kids are misdiagnosed and medicated in ways that will basically prevent them from getting well because the powers that be don't recognize developmental trauma disorder or complex PTSD as a thing. Complex PTSD or CPTSD is not a diagnosis that's recognized in the DSM, but it is, and I'm not, I'm not giving out medical information. I am not a medical person or a licensed therapist or anything like that. I'm just talking from personal experience and from talking to therapists. But complex PTSD is not a diagnosis, not a recognized diagnosis, but people recognize that as, this is people who grew up with a pattern of trauma from childhood, right? It's not sort of a single traumatic event. It's ongoing neglect, abuse, witnessing domestic violence, substance abuse. There's all kinds of stuff that happens that's ongoing where a child doesn't feel safe or centered, and they get a complex of traumas around that. And so, it's something that, I don't know, maybe they'll recognize that diagnostically at some point. And I know there were a group of psychiatrists and psychologists who were trying to get something called developmental trauma disorder, which is another phrase for CPTSD, into the DSM. And for whatever reason that was refused. I don't understand the politics behind such things. So it's not a great thing. So, I'm going to talk, I'll talk, just briefly from the medical model perspective, not being a healthcare practitioner or a therapist, I don't have that level of expertise, but I can only talk from my personal experience with trauma. So I'll talk very briefly about that, but then I'll spend most of my time talking about, my own path and what's going on spiritually from the perspective of somebody who practices shamanism when somebody has trauma, somebody has long-term effects from trauma, what we've lumped into this PTSD category. So there's a lot of debate about, from the medical perspective, what is going on with trauma, right? It's very hard to pin down what's going on with people. And I think one of the reasons why childhood trauma may be different from PTSD that comes from sort of an adult being or a young adult even being in wartime is that they're different obviously when you're developing, your brain is going through different changes. When you're 8, 9, 10 years old or 2 years old, or, your brain is going through different changes, different stages of development than you are when you are an adult. And so the effects might be different from a purely physical perspective. We know that there are changes to the brain in PTSD, where there are physical changes. There is also, trauma as a dis-ease, right, is stored in different places. And this is why it can be hard to treat from a medical perspective. So when you look at a person has a body, it has a mind, has a spirit, has a soul. All of these things, people are complex. And from a psychological perspective, we try to treat trauma as a disease of the mind. From the medical perspective, we say that trauma is stored in the body. From a shamanic perspective, we say that trauma afflicts the soul. So which one of these is correct? To me, the answer is all of them are correct. Trauma affects people on all of these levels. It affects you energetically. It affects you physically, definitely. And it definitely affects you mentally, emotionally. I'll talk about my experience with trauma and some of my own symptoms. So when I was in my early 40s, I was married and I had 2 lovely kids and living quite a life in suburbia and small town suburbia, and had a great job, and everything was sort of hunky-dory. And all of a sudden, I experienced a severe bout of depression. It was not my first time experiencing that. I had severe anxiety on top of that. I had problems eating. I wound up losing a tremendous amount of weight in a very short period of time. I was having nightmares, difficulty sleeping, all kinds of stuff. I would have panic attacks if I had to visit my family, for example. So this is just a very short list of my, what I was going through at that time. And I decided, gosh, I have, no idea what's going on with me. It's really weird. And I decided to talk to a therapist at that point, which I highly suggest. I think if, I wish more people talk to therapists. See your shaman and see your therapist and see your doctor. Attack everything at every level. It's about spiritual warriorship, right? Working on every level. So I saw a therapist, and the therapist started asking me questions about my childhood. Oh, was anybody in your family an alcoholic or drug addict? I was like, well, sure, Did you witness domestic violence? Well, sure, yeah. Were you ever abused as a child? Well, sure, yeah. Were there ever situations of neglect? Absolutely. And at that point, I kind of cracked open. I kind of started remembering that, gosh, I've had bouts of severe depression since I was in preschool and since I was a child. And I had these, I remember being in school and having a panic attack and not knowing what it was. Just, unable to breathe and feeling flushed and kind of freaking out, when I was 8 or 9 or 10. What the heck was going on? And, eventually I got the diagnosis because they, to bill your insurance company, they have to give you a diagnosis of PTSD. And I have long been a spiritual person. I had been meditating my whole life, basically, and, practicing yoga and doing all kinds of things, experimenting with all kinds of spiritual paths. So as part of, treating myself, trying to work through these very severe issues I was having that interfered with everything, like my life fell apart a little bit. I couldn't work. My kids were affected, by seeing me in such a state all the time. My physical health declined. It was insidious. It was this horrible thing. And so I was meditating one day, and I, got this clear message, which I now recognize was from Spirit, that you need to go learn to practice shamanism. Not you need to go see a shaman and get a healing. You need to go learn to practice shamanism so that you can work on yourself. You can work on healing yourself. And I thought, wow, that's going to be really weird because I don't live in the jungle of Peru or in Siberia. And how am I going to find a teacher? And, just what's going on here? Like, I don't know how that's going to, and I didn't know the first thing. I don't even know what a shaman was. I didn't understand what shamanism other than things maybe I had seen on TV. I thought of, witch doctors and, people using, different hallucinogens in Central and South America. So I was like, gosh, I don't know, but it was compelling. The message was compelling, which is now, I didn't recognize it then necessarily, but now I recognize that's an indicator for me that it's a message from Spirit when I feel absolutely compelled to do something. As it happens, there is still a world-class, well-known, fantastic shamanic teacher who lived about half an hour away from me in the state of Maine in the United States. And Maine, interestingly enough, has a quite large and growing shamanic community. Who knew, right? I didn't know. I had no idea that this was true. And thank goodness. So I called my teacher and I said, I don't know anything about this, but this is the message that I got. And she said, she had an apprenticeship starting up, and she said, well, you've missed my last introductory class, and you have no experience and this and that, but I'll meet with you, and, you can, we'll meet for an hour, and then I'll figure out if you can join this apprenticeship. And then if you do, you're going to have to do a bunch of work on your own to prepare for it. So I did, and I told her my story, and she took me on as a student, and my life has never been the same. I found my path in shamanism, and obviously I'm using that to teach and help other people. My initial intention was never to work with other people. My initial intention was completely self-centered. I am just going to work on myself. I'm going to heal myself. I'm going to learn these techniques and technology, and technology sounds like a weird word, but it is. It's a science of healing. It's a spiritual technology. And I'm going to work, I am going to work on myself. And I have to tell you, that was the best thing that ever, best decision that Spirit ever pushed me into making, because I am, years later, it didn't happen overnight. It happened rapidly, because some people live symptomatically for, their entire lives, and that's terrible. So what happened was I eventually got my symptoms under control, and I live primarily symptom free. I don't have, generally speaking, and it's not to say that I'm happy jumping for joy all the time. I have ups and downs like every other normal human being on the planet. I have try to be in a good mood, but that's not always possible. Life happens, things happen, but I am not out of control of myself. I don't have the symptoms that I used to when my life just fell apart. And yes, I have talked to a therapist, numerous therapists actually, and I think that is a necessary and important thing. But I also practice shamanism daily, obviously. It's now become a part of me. It's something that I am more than something that I do at this point in my life. I continue, though I, see people as a practitioner and I teach, I continue to train, I continue to learn. It's a lifelong learning path. It's something I love about it. I use it every day for information, for healing, for greater spiritual connection. I realize I'm not here to give a sales pitch about shamanism. I'm not into proselytizing, but it is what it is. So I'm just telling my story. So the important thing I think that I want to communicate is that I am not special. I'm not smarter than anybody else. I'm not more talented than anybody else. I don't have special insight. I'm unique, but still have everything in common with everybody else. And so what I want to share with you, this is where this becomes important, is that there is hope. That if you are living with symptoms of PTSD, there is hope that things can get better, that you can feel better, that you can control your symptoms. I do not judge what anybody does to cope or heal or anything like that. But I will tell you that I have never taken, except with one exception, I've never taken psychiatric medication. I've never taken antidepressants, except for, here's one exception. I had a concussion, and I had headaches continued. I slipped and smacked my head on the frame of the car door, which was not a fun thing, and got a concussion from it, and I had headaches that were ongoing, and they gave me a drug that was also used as it's like an old-fashioned tricyclic antidepressant, and so I took that for about a week, and that's my only use of antidepressants ever, and I wasn't taking them because I was depressed. I took them because I was having headaches from having a concussion. I also relied on shamanic healing. I had a month's worth of prescription medication, and I only took it for a week. This is just me personally. Again, I don't judge if you take medication for depression or anxiety or anything else. There is nothing wrong with that. I am not judging. I realize sometimes when I talk about my decision to not take medication, people feel like I'm saying, there's something wrong with you if you take medication or something like that. Never, ever, ever would I want to say that, imply that, or make you think that I think that. I do not. Whatever you're doing to cope, I will not judge. And that includes if you're doing unhealthy things to cope. So a lot of people cope with trauma by by taking drugs or drinking or getting, becoming sex addicts, or there's all kinds of sort of destructive ways, overeating. There are all kinds of ways that we self-medicate to deal with trauma, to deal with the effects of trauma. And again, I don't want you to choose unhealthy things. I want you to take care of your body, mind, and spirit. But I don't judge you for that. I don't say there's anything wrong with you for that. You're not a bad person. You're not you're not broken, okay? There's something going on. You've been through some stuff. And I think, on a side note, I think that addiction is highly, highly connected to trauma. So I think all of these methods of treating addiction, one of the reasons, there's lots of reasons why they're not always very successful, right? I think, if you look at the 12-step programs, their numbers are not very good traditionally. And again, I'm not putting anybody down. Like if you are part of a 12-step program and working it and it's helping you, again, no judgment. I'm just saying statistically, most people do not succeed with a lot of these traditional methods. And I think the issue is that if you treat the addiction, which is a symptom, and you don't treat the trauma, which is a cause, what I see is a lot of people shifting symptoms. I remember talking to a gentleman one time who had a pretty severe cocaine habit, and he, got into some trouble, had some repercussions from that, and decided to kick his cocaine habit, and he did, and that's good because that is a dangerous drug, right? You can definitely OD on that. You can kill yourself with too much of that. What he replaced it with was sugar, right? He had a severe sugar addiction, ate, tons of sweets, like a really abnormal amount of sweets. So from a harm reduction perspective, probably eating sugar is better than cocaine. I would, argue that he was in a better spot from doing less harm. But what he had done was replaced one addiction with another. And I see this over and over and over again with addiction. Somebody gives up alcohol and they wind up drinking tons of energy drinks and caffeine and, stuff, because we need, a lot of these addictive behaviors are meant to sort of cover up or, give us chemicals in our brain, or to basically not deal with the trauma. So if you're being treated for addiction, if you have, if you are an addicted person, I would encourage you to get help with trauma as well. So somebody in a class one time asked me if somebody was, and so we, most places in the world and definitely around here, we have huge problems with opiate addiction. Lots and lots of people got hooked on painkillers and now have moved to heroin and all this stuff. So somebody asked me one time if shamanic healing could help somebody who was actively in opiate addiction, meaning they're still using opiates. That's a hard thing for me to answer, because it's a little bit like renovating a house that's on fire, right? You can treat some of it, but the person's not in touch with the trauma. They're continuing to cover it up. They're continuing to cause trauma by using by using the opiates. So let's talk about trauma a little bit from the perspective of a shaman. What does a shaman see when they look at somebody with trauma, when they look with a shaman's eyes? And the word shaman in different languages can be translated as one who sees in the dark or one who sees clearly. Definitely holds the implication of seeing. And again, when I see somebody with addiction, or actually lots of different things present as trauma. So if you're in a helping profession, you're a therapist, you're a doctor, you're a spiritual healer, start to become aware of what people present with, because trauma can pop up in lots of different ways. It depends on the person. So for me, obviously there was mood disorder, mood disruption, anxiety and depression. There was problems with appetite, with eating. I couldn't eat. It would make me sick to eat. I had attention problems, like it was affecting my work because I couldn't focus on what I was doing. That's just I had the other parts too that indicated that it was PTSD. I had flashbacks. I had nightmares, trouble sleeping. So there can be this whole constellation of symptoms. So if you're in a helping profession and somebody shows up with addiction or depressive symptoms or all of these things, I can't even elucidate everything that somebody with severe trauma might experience. It might be a good thing to look into that. It might be a good thing, obviously do it, seek out some training and understand how to talk to somebody, be trauma aware, understand how to talk to somebody. And a big indicator of trauma is dissociation. That is kind of the number one. Whatever else anybody experiences, trauma is dissociative. And if you don't know what dissociation is, it takes on two forms. One is depersonalization, meaning I feel like I'm outside my body, right? It's that feeling that you're outside your body, which, a lot of, on the shamanic path, if that kind of sets you up for being a good shamanic practitioner, being able to get outside your body. Unfortunately, sometimes it takes trauma to do that. So that's depersonalization. Sometimes I have experienced this. You feel like you're floating above your body or you're behind your body, like you're not in your body. And the other one is derealization, meaning you feel like, and I've experienced this as well, you feel like the world you're experiencing isn't real, like you're in a dream. And, it's interesting to me. I've had clients come to me before who, reported, they're like, oh, I feel really dead inside. And I said, well, do you have an experience with trauma? And no, nothing like that. Okay. Well, do you ever feel like things aren't real? Oh yeah, all the time. Do you ever feel like you're floating outside your body? Oh, sure. So, and then I do diagnostic journey, and then I can see that there's trauma there. But those, just from questioning those kinds of things, and that might be a good set of questions. Do you ever feel, ask questions around, if you're in a helping profession, ask questions about dissociation, and if it's a regular occurrence for people, it's a really good indicator that there's some trauma, even if the person isn't aware of it, because it will tell you that for most of my life, I did not remember most of my trauma. And it's weird. It's not, one of the things I struggled with was, there can be false memories, and that's absolutely, memory is fallible, particularly from childhood. Memory is a process. It's not a static thing. Your memory is not like storing something on a computer and recalling, storing a file on a computer and recalling it later. Your memories are connected to everything else you've gone through, and filters and things you've watched on TV and all this stuff. So you might think you have objective memories about things, and they aren't. And so I struggled with are the things I'm remembering real? And then I got confirmation from family members. Oh yeah, that definitely happened. Okay, well, consensus then tells me the things I'm remembering are real. So, dissociation. Ask about depersonalization. Do you ever have the experience of feeling like you're, floating? Not when, obviously, when you're meditating or trying to do something, have an out-of-body experience, or, if you are taking hallucinogens or something like that. I'm talking about when you're walking around in daily life. Do you ever feel like you're floating outside your body? Or do you ever feel like you're walking through a dream, like things aren't real? Or both of those things. And that is dissociation. Prime indicator. And dissociation is a survival mechanism. So what happens when we experience trauma? You go through some shock, some big fright, or you see something that horrifies you, or you are on the receiving end of some violence. From a shamanic perspective, your part of your soul body leaves. It's like, it is not safe here, and I am going to save myself from witnessing this, experiencing this. It's a protective mechanism of the soul. And unfortunately, what can happen is something called soul loss, meaning that part of you fails to return, fails to rejoin the rest of you. You can think of it as like breaking off a little piece of you and leaving it behind in time and space. This is all kind of metaphoric. It's not really metaphoric. I mean, this is, soul loss happens, but using words to describe what's going on is sort of imprecise. We'll just put it that way. So from a shamanic perspective, some piece of you gets broken off. With ongoing, complex PTSD, childhood trauma that's ongoing for years, more and more and more of you can get broken off. So if you have a traumatic event, like you get into a car accident and it's horrific and you fear for your life and all these things, you can definitely, have some traumatic symptoms from that. You can have soul loss from that. Some piece of you can break off. With long-term trauma, it's like more and more and more of you breaks off and gets zapped away, gets hidden, or is hiding. These, we call them soul essences. These essences hide. Parts of you say, it's not safe for me to experience joy, or it's not safe for me to stand up for myself or question adults, or all of these things. And that it does inform our personality as well. What is safe and what is not safe. So much of our personality is informed by what is safe and what is not safe. And as human beings, we are not evolved very much from our ancestors who were, lived in caves and trees and had to hide from tigers that could eat them. So biologically, spiritually, mentally, we're not much different than that. But the threats are different, right? There's no tiger in the forest, but we act when our boss is yelling at us. The same mechanisms pop into place as if the tiger is stalking us in the forest. We're not, we think of ourselves as modern humans because our technology has enhanced. We live in houses, we have the internet, all of these things. But our makeup, the things that makes us who we really are, have not changed in tens of thousands of years. hundreds of thousands of years, maybe a million years. I don't know. First evidence of modern humans keeps getting pushed back, so I don't know what the timeline is now. But definitely tens of thousands of years, we see symbolic thought and, religious activity in caves and that sort of thing. Definitely shamanic activity. So these essences sometimes get lost. Sometimes they come back. Sometimes they come back on their own. How a shaman would treat trauma is it would do a ceremony that's called soul retrieval. And so they would travel in non-ordinary reality to locate the pieces that are ready to come back. This is important, the phrase ready to come back. You can't force this stuff. And these parts of you can think of them almost like little sub-personalities, little people that you break off. If you're in a situation where it does not feel safe for this part to come back, it may not be ready to return. And, a shamanic practitioner cannot force that part to come back. We don't really do force. Okay, so shamanic practitioner would travel in non-ordinary reality with a helping spirit, locate the parts that are ready to come back, bring them back, merge them with the soul body of the person that they're working with. And then there's usually an integration period of several weeks, because you got to remember, you might have lost these parts, when you were a child, and you might be an adult now, and you might not be used to these energies coming back. So there's an integration period. We normally wouldn't do, sometimes people need more than one soul retrieval. Most people who need soul retrieval need more than one. I think everybody can benefit from soul retrieval, but most people need more than one. And, you really got to space those things out. You shouldn't be doing them every day. You definitely overwhelm your system doing that. And the other thing that happens is, there's usually some work that the client has to do to integrate that part. So an example might be, if a part is returned that is an essence of childlike wonder, there might be some integration work okay, you got to spend some time in nature and rekindle that childlike wonder at small things. Look at flowers and trees and plants and animals and birds, and that's just an example, right? And you have to spend some time doing that to reaccustom yourself to integrate that piece. The great psychoanalyst Carl Jung was all about integration, and he studied, he looked at shamanic practices. There are books written about it. There are books written about Jung and shamanism. It's all about integrating these parts. Now, from a psychoanalytic standpoint, you might say that these parts are in the unconscious. You have, archetypes and parts and subpersonalities, animus and anima, and all of these things. And it's just a different model. It's just a different structure. So many psychologists recently, working with trauma is, they do see trauma as this fragmented personality structure, right? And it's important to know that the word psyche, where we get psychiatry, psychology, psychiatric, psychoneuroimmunology, I can't spell that, but I can say it. It's important to understand that root word psyche is from the Greek, and it actually means soul. I do think that body, mind, and spirit are these sort of, we separate them out. These are parts, but they're overlapping. It's really hard to separate them, which is why trauma is an affliction of the body, mind, and spirit. And to treat it, you need to treat it well, you need to take care of all three things. Right. So when a shaman treats trauma and does soul retrieval, they're tending to the soul part, which is sort of the root core. If you don't take care of that, the other parts can't heal. The integration work is for the mind and the body. And if you see a shamanic practitioner and you get soul retrieval done, chances are you might, very frequently, there is a profound change almost immediately. Not always, but very frequently. You might feel like, gosh, I feel fantastic after that. That happens with a lot of my clients. They feel really great afterwards. And then I give them the integration work. And you might be tempted not to do the integration work because you feel great at that time. Do the integration work. Do the work the practitioner gives you. This is a key to, you might have some emotional relief. You might feel a physical release. You might, definitely the soul part has been returned and integrated into the soul body. But you want to get your system kind of in alignment. You want to get things, it's like, okay, I changed the tires on my car, but I didn't balance and rotate them, and I didn't balance the tires, and I didn't get an alignment done. So I'm just going to keep going and keep wearing the tires down on my car. Got to get everything taken care of. You get your tires replaced, you get the alignment done in your car so you don't wear them down on the edges. And, I don't know why I always sort of talk about people from, I'm not a really big car person, but I always talk about people from the perspective of cars. I guess because cars are complex systems and so are people, right? Cars have electrical systems and coolant and engines, and nowadays they're all computerized and electronic, and they have tires and undercarriage and a frame, a body, a frame, and then the panels and the shell, the windshields, and there's just so many parts. It's very complex, and humans are infinitely more complex than any machine that any human has ever built. Humans are infinitely more complex. Right? And even when I speak of body, mind, and spirit, that is such a simplification, right? When I say your body, the body that you have, how many systems can you think of? How many different types of cells? How many different types of proteins? And how many different types of neurotransmitters? How complex is the endocrine system? So your body is a physical thing, but it's also a bunch of processes. It's a bunch of systems. And your soul is just as complex. And your energy body is just as complex. And your mental body is just as complex. Human beings are complex. I find it fascinating. It's really interesting stuff. So back to trauma. And, so I would say if you, definitely, if you're experiencing some psychological symptoms and you don't, get some help. Definitely, if this brought up anything for you, talk to a counselor, a therapist, see your doctor, talk to a shamanic practitioner. And again, for me, and I'm not giving out any kind of medical advice. I'm not qualified to do that. Don't have a license to do that. Even if I did, I wouldn't do it on a podcast. For me, a big indicator is that dissociation. If you experience dissociation regularly when you're not meaning to, so yes, you can force yourself to dissociate when you meditate or when you do a shamanic journey or you practice astral projection or other things. Or sometimes you get sick and you kind of feel out of it. That's normal. Not to say that dissociation is abnormal. It's not the regular, it's not ordinary. It's not the regular state of the way things are experienced by people. I don't know how to put it. I'm trying to be non-offensive here. Is that clear? I don't want to call you abnormal if you experience dissociation. Dissociation is a very normal, adaptive process, in my honest opinion. I do not think dissociation is maladaptive. I do think it shows up at times when it's inconvenient, and that might be considered maladaptive, right? I remember a time I was a boy. I was in Boy Scouts. Maybe I was 13 or 14 years old, and we were camping, and we had a big bonfire. And if you've never experienced Boy Scouts, you have a big bonfire, and everybody gathers around, and you sing songs, and you do funny little skits, and it's pretty entertaining. It's a fun way to end a day. And we were headed back to our tents where we were sleeping, and I just remembered everything started moving in slow motion, and I felt like I was in a dream, and I felt like I was outside of my body, peering down on it, and thinking to myself, what is going on here? Like, I really didn't understand. And I asked, I remember asking the boys I was walking with, do you guys feel like you're in a dream right now? And they were like, no, I don't understand. So it was a really weird thing for me. But then I have experienced that through my life. And then when things sort of really broke down for me later in my life, in my early 40s, I was experiencing dissociation all the time. So if it's something you experience, I think it's a good indication that there's probably some trauma there, even if you don't remember what it is. And I don't want to try to implant false memories, because it is not important to relive your trauma. It's not. From a shamanic perspective, you don't even have to remember what the trauma is to heal the missing soul, to do soul retrieval. I have done soul retrieval on lots of people who were like, I don't know at what point in my life that this thing came from. So spiritually, there is also ancestral trauma. There's also trauma that's passed down through families. So something severe goes on in your family many generations back, and I could not even tell you how far back this goes. The research is still out on this. And that gets passed along. On a physical level, we can see epigenetic changes in the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. So we know on a physical level, we can see the remnants of severe trauma at least a couple of generations in human beings. And that's purely physical. And I can tell you on a spiritual level, it is much farther back than that. And maybe someday, we'll see, I don't know what kind of research would have to be done, but we'll see physical changes manifesting in people generations and generations and generations later. And how many of us do not come from some history of some traumatic history? How many of us cannot, like, if you go back far enough, the history of humankind is being displaced or enslaved or, war or famine or any of these horrific things. So, I think it's fair to say that there's trauma in everybody's family history and everybody's ancestral line. I cannot think of a culture where that would not be true. It may not be recent. It may not be in the past, few generations, but certainly, if I look at my, some of my own ancestry, some of my Irish ancestors came over during the potato famine and probably lost the Irish potato famine and probably lost family members and experienced starvation and all kinds of stuff. And then when they got here in the U.S., were treated poorly, very poorly, by the people who were already here. Same thing with, some of my other ancestors. I've had ancestors that were kidnapped by Native Americans here, after landing, and had their infant murdered in front of them. There's trauma in everybody's, so even though my European ancestry were colonizers and, were, in part responsible for causing a lot of strife and heartache and disease and taking over lands and warfare and all of that stuff, that's not to say their trauma is any less, right? So it doesn't matter what your family history is, you deserve to heal from your trauma. You deserve to heal from the trauma that you're carrying. And there's a lot. Culturally, there's a lot of trauma. So there's another aspect that can happen with soul loss. There can be, trauma can be this, we think of it as like, I go through something really horrific and shocking. And yes, absolutely, that's sort of classical definition of trauma, most dramatic, most impactful. But there can be situations where it's, I don't have fantastic terminology for this yet. Maybe somebody can, if somebody thinks of it, maybe I'll talk to some therapist friends of mine to discuss this sort of level. There's sort of this low level ongoing trauma. So an example of that is something isn't necessarily shocking, but there is a long-term either neglect or threat to survival, right? Which neglect is a threat to survival, particularly if you're a child. So I mentioned like the Irish potato famine that some of my ancestors lived through. And, seeing people around you dying of starvation and worrying about where your next meal comes from is living in a constant state of unsafety and fear. And in my own background, having, a background of, child abuse and living in a family where there was alcoholism and domestic violence and all of these things, there's this constant underlying sense of unsafeness, right? Where there's no center, there's no place to cling on to that says, I'm safe. And so what can happen during those periods where there's maybe not an active threat, maybe somebody's not being particularly violent in that moment, there's this low-level existential fear. Am I going to be safe? Is something going to happen to me? Even if it's not articulated, there can be this slow leak, like you have a pinprick in a tire. I'm using a car analogy, I guess. You have a pinprick in a tire that's a slow leak away of soul essence. You might be living in a relationship that is emotionally abusive. And, long term, that will cause soul loss, cause significant soul loss, right? Because that emotional abuse doesn't give you, it makes you feel unsafe over a long period of time. And that creates, it creates trauma. It creates all kinds of, again, the same kinds of issues, even though you may not be able to pin down, this, huge dramatic event happened to me. So there's a couple things I want to mention before I wrap up talking about trauma. And one is, animals, particularly mammals, experience trauma as well. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to observe a dog or some other kind of animal experiencing like a shock or a fright or, whatever. And universally, what you'll see, except for human beings, for some reason, we don't do this, you'll see them literally shaking off the trauma, right? So something will happen, and you'll see a dog like get up and shake itself off. Like, oh, that's odd. Dogs shake off when they're wet. They shake the, whatever. It is a nervous system reset that they're doing. Animals are mostly pretty good. I mean, yes, you can traumatize animals to the point where they, they have issues. They can become overly aggressive or overly shy or fearful or whatever. That definitely happens. But in general, because animals don't have, they don't have prefrontal cortex, and here I'm separating animals from humans. Humans are animals. We are soul equals, we'll put it that way. I'm just talking about the brain at this point. But most animals, particularly mammals, are fairly good at shaking off a lot of these day-to-day traumas that they experience, where human beings are not. And there's that, there's that sort of shaking thing. And the other thing I'll mention is there's a lot of fantastic research finally going on trauma right now, and it's everything from how trauma is stored in the body to how the vagus, well, I guess this was about trauma in the body, but how the vagus nerve, and polyvagal theory and all of these things with trauma. And then there's also a lot of research starting now with psychoactive medications that are traditional medications, and we would consider them hallucinogens or entheogens. So there's a lot of experiments going on with, well, not all of them are traditional. So they're experimenting with LSD now. They're experimenting with psilocybin, and some of the more modern synthetic psychoactive medications like MDMA and things like that. It's very difficult in most countries to experiment, and there are fantastic results, right? These psychedelics, so psychedelic assisted therapy is being studied. It's hard to study these in most places. In the United States, most of these substances, or all of them, are considered what they call Schedule I drugs, meaning that some bureaucrats in the, some department in the government have decided that these drugs are highly dangerous and have absolutely no legitimate medical value. Which is, and both parts of those are, for these drugs that they're finally able to experiment with, are absolutely ridiculous. Absolutely 100% false and ridiculous. Take psilocybin, for example, on a chart of, on the research showing harm to humans. So they're talking about, what can cause severe harm. And they ranked 33 drugs in order of most dangerous to least dangerous, and they take into account things like addictive nature, ability to overdose, things, and they rank it as harm to self and harm to others. Right. So if I'm, heroin causes a lot of harm to others because people are, doing terrible things to get access to the drug, or that sort of thing. And alcohol, so alcohol is like third or fourth. It's like the third or fourth most dangerous drug on the chart. Psilocybin, which if you don't know, is commonly called magic mushrooms. It's the psilocybin is the active chemical in mushrooms. It is like 16th on the list. It's way down the list from alcohol, which is legal in most places. So it means it's less harmful than alcohol. So the extreme risk to humans thing is false. And then the idea of no medicinal value. Traditional cultures have been using it for centuries, if not millennia. They are now proving the medical use. There are places in the U.S. that are decriminalizing mushrooms. I think this is a good thing. I think anything that provides relief for people, and particularly when we can look at indigenous wisdom, these people who sort of had to survive in harsh circumstances and knew how to heal themselves using the materials that were around them. We should be looking at that. We should be honoring that. So the idea that this substance is harmful, as harmful as something like heroin and has no medicinal value, both of those things are ridiculous, but the bureaucrats have placed it on the highest level of restriction that you possibly could. And the issue with that is it makes it very difficult for researchers to experiment with it, because they have to get all of this special clearance from the Food and Drug Administration. Stuff has to be tightly controlled. And so it hinders research that could really be helping people out there. So, and I would love to see more research with, these tools being done in accompaniment with shamanic healer. So maybe we train therapists in shamanic healing, or maybe a therapist works in conjunction, or a psychiatrist works in conjunction with a shamanic healer. Let's take all approaches. Let's bring people relief. Let's heal people. Let's help them experience their wholeness and fullness and live a life of joy and fulfillment. And let's not hold people back from that, because for not, I can't think of a good reason for that. So anyway, I'm not being political here. I'm just being pragmatic. I just think, some of the ways these things are enforced cause more harm than good. And we should be looking to do less harm. We should be looking at harm reduction. So that is trauma, and I'm sure I will speak more about this in the future. I have written a lot about trauma and my experience with trauma. I, obviously I'm getting a little tongue-tied at the end of this. I've written a lot about trauma. It's a topic that's important to me. It's a topic that's personally important to me because, I have been through the healing process, and I hope that I can give you some hope that if you experience trauma, or there are people in your life who have PTSD symptoms or whatever, that you can get better. You can control your symptoms. You can feel better. You can't say cure because that's a medical term and it has specific terminology, but you can live symptom-free. It takes work. It takes seeking help. It takes a willingness to seek the help that you need. But if you do, there's hope. And I am living proof of that. Like I said, I am not special. I'm not smarter than anybody. I am not any more blessed from Spirit than anyone else. Spirit did give me some information that I guess helped me out tremendously. And I wound up being able to help other people. And I love that more than anything in my life. I love doing that. I love helping people. I love talking to you all about trauma, and I love seeing clients and helping them through some of the things that I have experienced. With that, I will leave you, and I will talk to you next time.
You have been listening to Speaking Spirit with your host, John Moore. For more info or to contact John, go to mainshaman.com. That's maineshaman.com.